My author is Stephen King. He is one of the most famous writers in the world, with a pretty interesting life. I read two of his great-selling books, which were Carrie and Firestarter. I don't like to read, but I can tell you that I really like these two novels. His full name is Stephen Edward King. He was born on September 21st, 1947, in Portland, Maine. He has written over 50 novels in his life and has won over 51 awards. He was the second son of Donald and Nellie Ruth Pillsbury King. He has an older brother, David, that grew up together with their mother because their parents split up when they were little. He married his wife, Tabitha, in 1971. They own 3 radio stations together, which helps them keep an open mind. The two of them have 3 kids, Naomi, Joe, and Owen. He reflects information from his kids to help him reach a child's point of view when writing books. In his immediate family, there are 4 out of 5 authors. His wife has published 7 novels. His oldest son, Joe, writes about horror following his father's footsteps. The youngest, Owen, writes about short stories and published 1 novella, but he also married a writer. Naomi is the only one who is not an author. She is a minister in a church in Florida, but is still loved by her family for being different. Stephen King mainly writes about horror, but he also writes science fiction and fantasy. Other than his books, he has also written scripts for television shows and short stories. Every day, Stephen King writes over 2,000 words just so he can practice and get his writing skills stronger. He does this to help improve each new book he writes. His favorite band is AC/DC, which I think help him write his horror books. The style of music that AC/DC plays helps Stephen find the anger in his characters he is writing about, to make this book seem more realistic. He suffers from triskaidekaphobia, which means Stephen King is scared of the number 13. None of his books end on multiples of 13, so 94, 193, 382, and so on. Even when reading books, he won't stop on multiples of 13. He also loves cheesecake, cranberry orange cheesecake to be exact. There has been many accidents in Stephen King's life that has affected his writing greatly. He claims that in the 1980s he does not remember a lot, due to alcoholism. He says that one of his most famous books, Cujo, he has no memory of writing it at all. He has stopped drinking, which has improved his writing significantly. As a child, Stephen King witnessed his friend get killed by a train. He watched his friend pass away, and he says this has been his motivation for most of his books that he writes. Some have been dedicated to his friend. This allows Stephen to put some anger and violence in his books because he is reaching out to personal experience, which makes his books closer to his heart. In 1999, he was in a fatal accident. He was hit by a van, which put him in the hospital with a collapsed lung, a broken hip, a huge gash in his head, and a leg broken in 9 places. The man who hit Stephen King was Brian Smith. After doing this, Brian later kills himself on King's birthday by overdosing. After the injury happening to him, Stephen could really write his horror novels from a different level. He could see the different points of view of all the characters he writes about. Stephen King is an amazing horror writer, and all his life events and historical events help improve his writing throughout all his novels. All of his childhood, leading to his first book, he has gone through many huge historical events, like wars and many deaths. He was born in 1947, and the Korean War was from 1950 to 1953. He was 3 to 6 years old, where this huge war is happening around him. Then in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, creating huge havoc around the world. From 1964 to 1975 is when the Vietnam War was. At the end of the war was when he published his first book, which was Carrie, in 1973. The plot of Carrie would resemble the streets of Korea and Vietnam during the wars. Everyone running in fear, screaming, where the people with great power or with the guns will be walking down the streets, which is like when everyone is running from Carrie, when she is walking down her road to her house. These are 3 big events that have happened during Stephen King's childhood, but there are many more during those time periods and many more after that will help him continue to write more of his novels, each one giving him more ideas and help him keep writing. All these historical events have helped Stephen write more and more horror books over the years. All the horrific things that have happened around the world help him get more of an understanding to literature. The surrounding fear that happens around him allows him to get the plots and characters to perfection when writing his novels. Stephen King loved the Boston Red Sox, and he ended up writing a book about them called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which soon after the book, the Red Sox ended up ending the drought that they had for 80 years without winning a championship. In 1991, in the Gulf War, the U.S. defeats the Iraq and frees Kuwait, which shows how there isn't only bad in the world and good things can happen out of bad situations, which also gives Stephen more ideas to write about and more ideas to change the plot to during his novels. Ronald McDonald was created in 1974. Stephen King made the clown Pennywise, which is made after Ronald. Stephen used the idea of Ronald to make Pennywise. Pennywise was put in the famous book It, which was published in 1986 and just got turned into a newer movie that is out in theaters. When Stephen King was writing Carrie, he actually threw it in the garbage thinking it was bad. But then, his wife Tabitha actually pulled it out of the garbage and made him finish writing it. Carrie is what launched his career to success. So Tabitha was the one who saved him and kept his dream alive about becoming a famous writer. This quote relates to how Stephen King has a fear of drinking now. Like I said earlier, he quit drinking because he doesn't remember a century of his life due to alcohol. He writes this in his novel Carrie because it relates to his life. He was the one always getting beered up, and he writes just a small little line just to try and scare anybody who is ever thinking about drinking. There's not much to this quote, but if you look, you can see the hidden image of a horror that Stephen has for alcohol. This is imagery because of how Stephen King relates fear to alcohol. He relates to alcohol many times throughout all of his books, and each time he does this, he puts it in a passage to try to use it as fear. Which people should be scared of alcohol. People only think you need alcohol to have fun, but that's not the case. You can have fun by doing anything. You don't need this liquid to have fun. Which is the last thing he tries to say in this quote. He says that only ones who think it was fun was the ones that did drink. But he shows this in a negative way. He tries to tell us that you need to look deeper within what you are doing, because if you don't, it will be a waste of time and you won't think of much of it. He follows through with the theme of horror because he finds it easy to relate with everything going on in the world. Through this quote that Stephen King wrote in the novel Firestarter, we are able to see what Stephen King was talking about if you look closely. He tells us how the world is a good place, but there are still those awful things that can happen and bad people in the world. He relates this to himself because you can see by all his previous life experiences that he has gone through, so much like not remembering a century of his life or being in the edge of dying. Plus with all the other world issues that are happening around him and everyone else. But Stephen King has a great life. He is one of the world's best authors with William Shakespeare, and his life is great. He has an amazing family, he has lots of money. Most of you would not know what Stephen King has gone through, like these horrible situations. We only see the success he has in his life, which is like the theme, don't judge a book by its cover. We can see that Earth is a good place, but there are still horrible things that happen underneath the surface of good. This is how Stephen King also leads his novels towards violence, because he looks below the surface to see the horrible things that have happened around and creates them into plots. The reader gets a view into the thoughts and visions of the characters to add suspense, an important part of horror. The use of diction helps enhance the genre of horror. Everything that Stephen King has gone through in his life has affected his writing one way or another. A lot of horror has gone on throughout his life, which is the main reason why Stephen King is such a good horror author. All the fear he has gone through has helped put fear into his characters that he writes about. The way his brain thinks is unimaginable compared to ours, or at least mine. We all process and distribute information in different ways, but the way he does it is remarkable. He is such a talented human being and is credited for so much, but not credited for enough.